thank you all for coming. So we're going to try to do a bit of an abbreviated panel here because I really want to talk about activism and the inspiration for activism. And I'm going to start with Leighton Gray because we had a discussion earlier and he came with some very strong ideas. So the activist movement for the truckers convoy, no one imagined that it was going to be what it became or how long it became or that it would end the way it did. But it became that because people just went and did something. So that got done, and that's behind us, and that's with us, and we hold that, and the film is a reminder, but the moment is all there with us. But Leighton has some amazing ideas about how we can start to organize things, how we can start to plan, to move activism into a more solid movement going forward.
Thanks. First of all, it's great to be here. I really enjoyed listening to the other panelists. On the subject of activism, there's a man who you might have heard of. If you haven't, you really should check him out. I think one of the most brilliant scholars in the world. His name is Dr. Thomas Sowell, and he's at Stanford in the United States. He's part of the Hoover Institute. And he said something funny about activists. He says they're basically useless people that rarely do any good for the people they're supposed to help, in fact, end up hurting them. I think one of the best examples of this is going to be Black Lives Matters, which now means, I think, big luxury mansions, right, Chris? But, you know, the thing about activism is the other guys on the left do this a lot better than us. And this is something, a good starting point. You know, we think of Marxists, you know, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win. It's like, whoa, you know. And then, you know, on our side, we say, well, no new taxes. It doesn't really have the same... it doesn't really resonate the same way. And you'll listen to Chris Barber, and watching that, well, we started to get a really powerful slogan. Freedom. Freedom, right? And if that's one of the keys, if the way we use language, as some of the panelists were talking about earlier, is really, really key. So that's a good starting point. The root of activism, of course, is to act, right? And what we're seeing now, if you've been following the news, is you know, before we can act, we've got to have good ideas. Vlad was talking about that. You got to know where you're going. And I'm from Alberta, as is Chris. And some of the things that are happening in Alberta, like the Alberta Prosperity Project, I think are applicable here and useful. One example is, I don't know if any of you saw this, recently the mayor of Calgary decided that she was just going to cancel Canada Day celebrations. Right. Well, the good people of Calgary started a petition, and it grew very quickly. 10,000 names. And while their mayor was off in Toronto talking to God knows whom, the rest of the city council got together and they brought back Canada Day. And you might have noticed also that, and of course these things happen in threes and they seem to be all by design because they are, when Calgary got rid of the fireworks, so did Toronto and then Vancouver. Well, Toronto followed suit. They brought back Canada Day. So we're waiting on Vancouver. But that shows you the power, the act in activism. And this is what we've seen a lot of in Alberta. And more particularly, I was talking earlier about the Take Back Alberta, which is a huge thing that, and as an example of the kind of activism. So what happened with Take Back Alberta is we had a premier named Kenny, right? And he hired somebody named Himshaw that we helped to get fired, right? By the way, you have her now. Yes, she's your problem now. I cross-examined her for 4 days. That was fun. Yeah, anyway, I won't say what I think of her. She knows. But the thing about Take Back Alberta, before I pass on the mic, Take Back Alberta was a group of people who wanted to get rid of Jason Kenney. And they went to the top 3 or 4 most generous donors, conservative donors in Alberta, raised a lot of money very quickly, got rid of Jason Kenney, gone, boom. And now, our adjacent to our new premier helped her rise to leadership. And God willing, we're going to get a UCP government on May 29th. And you know, just to give you the idea of the power of Take Back Alberta, Dr. Jordan Peterson, who wouldn't it be great if he were here, has to be the greatest public intellectual in the world right now, right in our country, and the least celebrated Canadian, I must say, for what he does. No offense, Chris Barber, but you know, Take Back Alberta. Jordan Peterson was coming to Alberta to speak in Edmonton and Calgary. Take Back Alberta, within a few days, went to a donor in Red Deer, raised Jordan Peterson's unholy speaking fee. By the way, he's worth it. I went to the show. But that they raised in a few days and got Jordan Peterson to come to do another show in Red Deer. And the proceeds of that went to Take Back Alberta and the UCP government. So what I'm saying to you, and what I'd say to people here in British Columbia, is this can be done. But the root of activism is really important. We must act. You've got to take action. You've got to get going. But you know, Take Back Alberta is one example of what can be done, or you know, reviving Canada Day when the politicians try to cancel it. These things can be done, but it takes action. I think that's really important.
Thanks very much, Leighton. I want to prompt Chris a little bit here, because you said a couple of things that really resonated with me. One was, I'm done worrying about offending people. You became an activist simply by doing what you do, right? Just simply by there was a movie in the 90s called the Milagro Beanfield War, if anybody heard of that. And the guy's act of defiance was to water his field because the water was under control. You basically just opened up your kept running your place. But the other thing that really resonated with me was the phrase, defend myself against the government. And I think that this needs to be instilled in Canadians to some degree, that our Eastern European friends understand it from birth. Well, how do you think that we could get this phrase further out into people? That people understand that the government is no longer on their side. This notion of it being our babysitter is gone.
Well, before I speak on that, it just occurred to me that at times activism can be a simple, everyday thing that you normally do. Watering your grass, serving somebody a hamburger, pouring a coffee, or maybe making salt. I mean, does anybody know somebody who made salt in an act of defiance? I do. He's one of my heroes. It was Gandhi, by the way.
I know somebody who had a restaurant, and he set it up as a drive-in in the middle of COVID. I don't know, but that's something you could do, right?
Yeah, so my point is that activism isn't always some grand scheme like climbing a clock tower, and becoming the federal minister of the environment and climate change. And I don't know if that was a Freudian slip. I apologize, but I'm glad you got a chuckle out of it. Whew, this is live too.
Hot seat.
Yeah, it's after hours. So, on to the next thing. Thank goodness there's a next thing. The phrase defend yourself against the government is something that Canadians they don't understand for the most part. I certainly didn't understand, because I was brought up to believe that the government did things to our benefit. It actually says right in the Constitution that the government, our legislators, are to make law to benefit us. Right, Leighton? Yeah, it says that. He's a lawyer, he knows. So I thought, well, if the politicians and the government are making laws to our benefit, why would I have to defend myself against them? That's something that they have to do in other countries across the ocean. Canada's very young. We're 150 years old and change. I just went to Europe, and I was in a place that's 1,000 years old. And they've experienced these things before. They've had to defend themselves against the government. And in Canada, we have no idea. We haven't really had to do it. Pardon me. There are groups within our country that have certainly had to defend themselves against the government. I don't want to take anything away from that. But what I mean to say is the majority of Canadians haven't a clue. So if people would bother to pay attention to history, they would know that no matter what kind of government you have or how free you believe you are, you always have to be prepared to defend yourself against the government. And That's one of the things that we try and do with the Alberta Prosperity Project, for instance, which could be considered an activist group, it's an educational group, is we're trying to educate people as to the necessity of these activist acts, the necessity of preparing yourself or knowing how to defend against the government, because at one time it's going to happen. But again, it's one of those things that you say it to a lot of people and immediately they're offended because their view of Canada, their view of this country is that it's the freest place on earth and it will always be that way. But that in itself is the reason why we're in danger right now.
Thank you. You mentioned the salt, making salt. I was in a meeting with Preston Manning, and he said, you know, after 200 years of occupation, British occupation in India, it was when they taxed the salt that they stood up. And I lived in India, working for CTV News for 3.5 years, and you can't sit down at a restaurant without somebody asking, which of your drinks do you want salt in? You've ordered a soda, do you want salt in it? You've ordered a yogurt drink, a lassi, do you want salt in it? Because you sweat all day long in that country most months, and salt is required for survival, and when they taxed it, they said no. And then Mr. Manning said, we need a salt tax. And there was another very wise man in the room said, vaccinating babies. That's the punch in the gut. And if we can say no to that, then maybe we can say no to vaccinating 12-year-olds and maybe no to vaccinating our grandmothers. And when we can start to think about it, we need to engage that thought process. And I wonder, Ron, I'm going to go you next on this. Can you think of something that can really get people, something that can waken them up, something in that movable middle, and turn the general public into what Chris says is an activist? Just do and be, and everyone be the activist. Is there something that we can get at that's going to light them up?
Well, okay, before we get on to that, one thing I wanted to say, I didn't want to interrupt actually when the interview was going on. I interrupted a couple other times. But really the convoy happened, it seemed like it just kind of popped out of nowhere, but really it was built on the convoy of 2019. Who knows about that convoy? It was the oil and gas convoy, and it started in Red Deer, and Glenn Carr was heavily involved in that. I was there actually filming it, minus 30, it's on my YouTube channel, and they went across Canada. The Trudeau Liberal government didn't listen to them whatsoever. They didn't even come out, and I knew that was going to happen in the second convoy, that they're just going to ignore it. But like the first convoy, I mean, it got a lot of people, you know, realizing what's going on and backing it. And then when it happened the second time, it was on steroids, right? And that's actually by doing some sort of activation of that sort, then other people will start to see what's going on. And that would be answer to the question, is that by people stepping into the ring, then other people can see what, you know, hey, there's something going on here. And that's the reason why I ran for the PPC twice. You know, it was a Hail Mary long shot, I knew, but I still committed myself to it. And I was able to get out, you know, in northern BC, 20,000 flyers talking about UN Agenda 2030. You know, as Bob Zimmer warned, how your life is going to radically change. And then we had our debates, and I was able to bring up UNDRIP and these various different things. And so for each of us to be active, and I see a lot of you guys are activists already. I look at your vehicles out there. You know, it's funny.
That's how we know where to go. That's how we know whether we're in the right place.
Well, here's a funny story, actually. It's a video. It's one of my YouTube short videos. It's the first one. And I was in Kamloops, and my vehicle was being worked on. And so I basically was living on the street. I had a little tent, and I was by the river and everything else like that. So I was eating my supper over just, you know, downtown area. And all of a sudden I saw a truck go by with 2 flags in the back, you know. And I go, what's going on here, you know? And then I hear a PA system going on there, and a guy's walking up. And I said, what's going on over there? Oh, some kind of political thing over there. I says, I think I might know what that is. And actually it was the nurses talking about all of that, and I asked if I could speak on UNDRIP there, and they gave me some time. But so people are doing that, and that's the one thing, like, I've been in this game a long time, since the mid-'80s. That's when I was really red-pilled, and and I saw this whole rise of globalism. I saw how the propaganda was on TV with the new ads. They, like, we're all a connected world, and then they have some child walking across the world, and all this, it all just changed quite a bit. And back then it was like Looney Tunes if you were to try telling people what's going on. But this is a radical shift. 9/11 was a radical shift. I worked on my older brother for eons, and he says, "Ron, there's no way in hell that's going to happen," kind of a thing. And when 9/11 happened, he's a mechanic and he deals with physical things. And he knew that was a demolition right off the bat. So a lot of people, Mark Friesen says the same thing. He woke up at 9/11. And a lot of people really woke up with this COVID stuff, right? So now you got a lot of people doing all kinds, you got all these activists doing their own thing and starting groups and pushing forward. And even though we may not all agree and align and everything else, it doesn't really matter because we're all basically on the same base. Yeah, so.
Well, that's excellent. And I think that it's another thing that would be one of those salt tax ideas is admitting that the vaccine injured exist. I saw Robert Malone come out in Brussels, and the first thing he said was, this medical conference, if nothing else, recognizes the vaccine injured. And if you recognize that they're injured, then you have to think, how did they get injured? Is it really safe? Is it really effective? Then you let people think for themselves. And I think that might be another one. And talking what you just said about all these people doing what they do, all of you become the activists. You don't have to wait for the We Unify website to instruct you what to do. If you have an idea with this person or with that person, go and do it. Just go and do it. Get it going, whether it's local, provincial, national, internet, just start it and do it.
So one last point, though, on that is it's the politicians bringing this upon us in a major way. And so we need to educate them and we need to put their feet to the fire. It's good to protest and everything else, put the fear of God into them with the convoy. But if people get active, like what happened with Calgary there, with the fireworks and Canada Day, people went and stomped on them right away, right? And that's what we need to do.
And that will embolden them the next time they try something like that. Now that brings me to Kip, who I think is one of the most interesting profiles, professional profiles on this panel because of your expertise in computers. So I'm going to ask you a very specific question about the community. You gave us a whole presentation about the community that if you're not in the tech world, those people aren't famous, they're obscure. If you're in the tech world, they're rock stars, right? So is there a way that people who have your background can help us here? Because we are in a tech war that people like me are incapable of fighting back against. There was a story on the CBC about how when Facebook and Google were getting angry about the notion that we were just told earlier tonight that they would make them pay for distributing any news, they targeted CBC reporters' computers and wiped out their ability to find their own stories. So when a CBC reporter Googled herself, nothing came up. And they said, we just wanted to show you what it's going to be like. So the frightening thing for me about that is that they have the ability to do that to an individual. I had no idea. And there's so much more. So I think it's got to be the revenge of the nerds. I think if without the tech people, we have no real strong chance against this massive tech war. Do you have any thoughts on that, how we can tap into the tech community?
Well, I don't think that you need to wait for them to come to you. They've already done the work. But one thing I've found about the movement, at least since I got involved in it, the so-called freedom movement, is it tends to be very parochial. So you get people who are very staunchly aligned with a particular ideology. And the problem with doing that is they end up depriving themselves of useful tools that would have actually helped them solve practical problems. As an example, we were just talking about Gandhi, and he was a radical leftist. And Richard Stallman, who you just saw, he was a radical leftist. People gave you free software, open source software, Signal, things that keep your email secure and private. Those were all started by radical leftists. It might be uncomfortable for people to hear that, but there was another generation of the left in the 90s that was very different from what you might identify today with gender and identity pronouns, stuff like that. A lot of that is propaganda, but there was a time when radical leftists were very much interested in stopping wars, stopping government from placing people under surveillance, too much economic control, many of the things that the right is very much aligned with today. And but if you stay within your tribe, you're not going to know much about what's going on outside of it. And so for that man that you just saw in my presentation, he's known by millions around the world, but for most of you that was probably the first time you ever heard about him. But he has a solution, a practical solution that's been implemented for decades to protect people from surveillance, from mass, whether it's corporate authoritarianism or government control over people's lives. Those tools are there. And I think that if people start associating with people who are different from themselves ideologically, that would be a good thing for them. And maybe I'm cheating because my mother is very far left, and my father is very far right. And so I had a bit more, maybe the larger exposure, intellectual gene pool growing up than most people don't have that luxury. You know, if you grow up in a particular part of the country, you tend to assimilate your parents' ideas about the world, for the better or the worse, and that's just, I think, a natural evolutionary process. All organisms are like that. But that would be my advice to people, is that technological solutions are there, but when people are ideologically parochial, they're going to deprive themselves of certain tools that could help them solve the problems that they're very much concerned about.
I think that elevates the point that we've heard a couple of times in the last hour, which is we don't have to agree on everything, but we can agree on this. I wound up doing a live 2-hour broadcast with Glenn Beck in the United States from the front seat of a truck right out in front of the Peace Tower. And they said, kind of facetiously, so are there a lot of right-wing extremists there? And I announced, in my opinion, honestly, probably. And there's probably some lefties, and there's probably some people who don't have time to vote, but they all agree on this. And that was one of the first times I realized that I don't have to agree with everybody who's out here. There's not a chance I can agree with 100,000 different people on everything, but we can all agree on this, and I think that's a good theme that we're moving forward on.
Yeah, and I just encourage people to be careful about their language. The far right tends to accuse the left of being communists, and the far left accuses the right of being neo-Nazis, and most of the time people are pretty reasonable. They just have a different worldview. But you won't find out about that if you just always associate with people who are identical to yourself. So.
Yeah, and this is great. Vlad, I want to come to you next because I, like so many people in this room, have Eastern European friends, and all of them were on to this in a heartbeat, in a second. They all got it. There was a woman came to me tonight from former Czechoslovakia. And every time I've spoken, it's often women, and they all have the Eastern European accent. I instantly ask them, what's your birth country, and how long have you known about this? And they said they saw it coming from the front end. And I wonder, you touched on that in your message tonight, and I wonder if there's not a way to activate groups of Eastern European Canadians, of Eastern European descent, to say, like the members of the European Parliament said earlier this month in Brussels, we from the East believe it's our duty to warn you of what we see coming. Do you think that it would be helpful to have people like you who are born in Eastern Europe to make a group, come forward, talk to Canadians?
Well, the way I can answer that question is, and it doesn't have to be just Eastern European, it's basically anyone that comes from the countries that they had to face tyranny from the government.
Sure, it could be China.
So, for example, my wife, she's from Iran. So the whole situation in Iran is a whole other conversation to have, but I often say that she's bigger of an activist than me because she went to her first protest when she was a teenager girl in Iran, Stand Up for Freedom, And I went to my very first protest when I was 40 years old in Toronto because COVID rolled around. So what I'm getting to is that 100% you want to leverage the people that have experience with tyranny because they've been through it. But at the same time, I can say that her parents don't want to do anything with us. They help us, you know, we have young kids, etc., but they don't want to get involved because they escaped tyranny from Iran. So the last thing they want to do is fight tyranny in Canada. So to answer your question, the better way to approach what you just said, how can we leverage the existence of certain groups of people in Canada? And the best way I would say, and I was talking to Agatha about this yesterday or the day before, is that if we trust the government about one thing, not that I would suggest for you to trust the government at all, and I'll say something else in a moment, but if we do trust government about one thing, is that they said apparently that 82% of Canadians got at least one shot. Just for the argument's sake, let's say that's the case. Well, that means 18% did not. And what is 18% of Canadian population of 38 million people? Well, that's almost 6 million people. So if there would be one test that I would offer all of you, and again, nothing against the people per se that took the shot for multiple of reasons. I'm not passing a judgment. I'm just saying, if we can leverage a certain group of people within this country, is the one that were able to withstand the ultimate test and not to get any shots in the last 3 years. Because they showed leadership above all. Above all. All the pressures from not able to see on children like myself, losing jobs, losing careers, losing businesses, losing everything. Agatha, you know, one of the nurses from COVID unit in BC, right? Still standing. Like all these people passed the test. So if it would be one group of people that I would offer for everyone to lean on, is this type of people. Everyone's welcome, of course. If you've seen the truth now and for whatever reason you took it, we still love you. We still need your support. We need vaccinated more than we need the unvaccinated because there's so many of them and we need them on our side. But the point that I want to make as well in terms of how can we really combat this tyranny from the government, and I didn't say this in my talk earlier, is, and I've been saying this from the beginning for the last 3 years, there's 3 ultimate goals that I would offer everyone who's activist to focus on. And that is, become a leader yourself and elevate other people within your circle to become leaders themselves. Because the biggest challenge that we face, especially in the last 3 years, we didn't have enough leaders stepping up and leading the way for truth and for freedom. Second of all, and this is really tough for everyone and supposed to be tough, you have to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because standing up to tyranny is extremely uncomfortable. I'm getting goosebumps right now because do you think I was enjoying myself eating a soup in Toronto food court on the day when they launched the vax mandate and they said you're not allowed to eat inside a food court, and 6 of us went to Eaton Center in Toronto? And the joke, the irony of it, is they send a black guy and an Asian guy, cops, to discriminate against the white guy to eat the soup. That's the irony of life, right? The white supremacists over here, right? But that's life. You just have to roll with it. But what I'm getting to is that that's what we need. We need people that are willing to stand up and show the leadership and willing to be uncomfortable. And it is uncomfortable to not wear the mask when everyone else is wearing the mask, right? To go to the school and say, no, my son will not be abused by you because the TV and the government told you that you're allowed to. You're not allowed, right? And the last thing that we all have to continue doing, and we've been doing tremendous work, all of us here for the last 3 years, we have to really explain to Canadians that the government is not your best friend. The government is your worst enemy. The government is your worst enemy. And until more people get that ingrained in their mind, we're not going to be able to make a shift. And that's why I said earlier, like never before, talk to as many people as possible. They lie to you about everything. Everything. And the last thing that I'm going to say to finish my point is that we've been very fortunate. My generation and generation before me is that we lived in freedom. But if you look at the history, majority of the history of population always lived under tyranny. This is a short period of time in history where more people actually lived in freedom. And that's not normal. What's normal for humanity is to be oppressed. So we have to better wake up and wake more people up to see the truth And to be aware, like I said, awareness is step one. We have to know what we're up against, and then we come together with all the skill sets, The last thing I want to say is they have technology and they have the money, but we have the ultimate resource, and that's the people. We have the people. We have more people than they can be on their side. The things that we're struggling with, for these reasons, is we're not coming together. So how can we come together? Is with the language of freedom. Because we can have different viewpoints, keep an eye, work together, but also we stand apart on many different issues. But we stand together on one, and that's freedom. And that's the language we have to speak with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that started this movement was anger. People have said that's enough. And we saw a lot of the protests very early on. I watched them in Queen's Park in Toronto every Sunday, and the people were angry and they were yelling. Except the biggest rally that we had was based on love, not anger. The truckers' convoy was the biggest tingle in your tummy you ever felt if you were down there. And I don't think we need to go on too much about that. Chris and I talked about that earlier, but the one thing that I wanted to ask is, what's your advice, Chris, to people? What should they do from this day forward to move this activism ahead, to move it back to what Vlad is saying, to fight for freedom?
Well, the biggest thing I think we need to do is we need to keep it peaceful. Number one, that was the big thing in Ottawa. No matter what the government threw at us, no matter what the police threw at us, and they poked every day, whether it be taking the jerry cans, taking the fuel, the threats with euthanizing animals, child services coming in, taking kids. We remain peaceful, and that's what needs to go forward. The one way we lose this is violence, 100%, hands down.
Remember that Gandhi won.
Absolutely.
We also talked about engagement. How do you think people can engage their community, their councils, their school boards?
It starts at the lowest level of government. The rural municipalities. Become a counselor in your local, if you're in the rural. My father's been on council for 40, 50 years now. And when he retires from that, that'll be my job to take over my division or our division. Your school boards. Get involved with your school. That it starts there. These people are dictating what our children learn in school right now because we're not standing up to them. And that's the biggest thing. Get involved with your school board. Get involved with your local arm. Run for politics. Run for, provincial, whether it be federal, provincial, whatever it may be, but get involved with your community.
I think the lowest hanging fruit is finding a counselor who is already on side with us, and then asking them who is the other counselor on council who we're likely to win, and supporting somebody who's running for council who's with us. That's the lowest hanging fruit. And in the absence of that, create a candidate. Create the most likely candidate. Create the most famous person in your town. Whether it's the real estate agent with their picture on the billboard that everybody knows, an electable person. Get them on council and get as many of them as possible. The school board's an easy one because there are many positions on most school boards. And we used to call it the Borg instead of the board. It's a Star Trek reference to unified thinking. So it's tough once you get on there because they train you to do what you're told to do. But if you're already coming in with an agenda and with an idea, you could maybe make a difference in there. So I wanted to thank our panel. We're getting a little late, but we do want to see if there's any questions from the floor. If anybody would like to ask a question from any person, maybe you'd like to do we have a microphone, or why don't you just shout it out? I can repeat it. Yeah. Oh, we have one. Okay. Emmanuel has the microphone for you. Not this microphone. It would be that microphone over there. Yeah, this is my microphone.
This is Q&A. You guys bring the Q, they bring the A. So no grandstanding. Please, question.
Question starts with a who, what, where, why, or when.
Thank you, gentlemen, for all your efforts you've put forth. I have a quick question or a quick answer I want from Kip, if that's possible. Elon Musk hired an NBC executive, Linda Yaccarino, and he also has a mother that's posing with skulls and blood drenched all over her body. Is he all about freedom, or is he just an eccentric, elite billionaire nut?
Two options.
Well, In my space, those kinds of, I'm quite familiar with the Musk people. I mean, he's the most famous that people here know about, but in my space, that ideology, the techno-libertarianism, is very common, especially in Silicon Valley. And I've noticed certain patterns with them. They tend to be the opposite of what they claim to want to address, which is my experience with libertarianism, and which I don't subscribe to, is that they tend to be very authoritarian and like centralized control, which seems contrary to what you. But that's my point. Is that's not unique to him. It's common in that ideology. So I would just say that he's probably the most successful of those who subscribe to that ideology, but it's not unique to him.
Thank you for that. Second quick question. Any panel member that's up here, our leaders are obviously getting rich and powerful. They possibly sold us out to the Chinese or one world government. Why would the Liberal Party, NDP, or maybe even the Conservatives force our brothers and sisters to take an experimental vaccine or nanoparticle cancer-causing myocarditis jab that maybe tracks us or eventually kills us? So if I paid somebody on the panel here $1 million and offered them Jeffrey Epstein's island, what would it take for somebody on this panel to sell all the Canadian friends, families, and everyone else out and turn on all Canadians? What does the Liberal Party know and the other parties know that we don't know?
This is just an opinion and a hypothesis. But what if it wasn't our governments at any level that dictated these things? What if it was pre-existing agreements between big pharma and our governments that are the only thing that allow socialized healthcare to be achieved in our country? And it's all hanging on doing what they want regarding disease. What if?
This is, to me, I have a little bit of experience in this over the last 20 years, and I completely agree that we talk about healthcare, but really what we mean is disease management, and that's a business.
Sick care. It's called sick care.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with health.
Yes.
And to the point of different politicians is, the point is anyone who's doing anything, they're justifying that action in their head. Otherwise, they're not going to be doing it. So they have their own reasons, and a lot of times reasons are irrelevant because the outcome is what we're faced with. But the ultimate thing is, instead of focusing all the energy on changing the minds of corrupt politicians, we need to continue focusing and even more on changing the hearts of good Canadians.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any other questions? Did you have a question, did you say? While you come up there, I wanted to point out that I saw a great actor who was playing one of the evil Vaders in Star Wars, and they said, how do you play this evil? He says, he doesn't believe he's evil, he believes he's right.
That's it. That's exactly.
Well, I don't exactly have a question. I'm Doug Bebb, and I was also a two-time candidate. I have not met Ron in person. But on the topic of trucking and the issue perhaps was raised of having vaccine injury become common knowledge, we've been fairly active in trying to figure out how to crack this nut, this 40% central part of the Canadian citizen that could go either way. And there's a thing we came across, it's called YANA, I think, working from memory. It's Y-A-N-A, which is you are not alone. What they've done is they've leveraged the independent trucker with a billboard on the back.
I've seen it, yes. They put the back of the truck, and if you get stuck in traffic,
with
you
the victim,
see it.
so the testimony
Yes.
is right there in front of you. And
I interviewed some of
the
those
idea
people
that,
for the
there's
Canadian
more than
Pelvic
one,
Care Alliance.
and you're not alone, then vaccine injury is real. So I'm just wondering, maybe, Chris, if you've come across this YANA, and if there's any prospect there.
I have been asked to put billboards on my equipment. However, the stuff that I haul, my trailers are all flatbed, so they don't have the billboard style system. But I have been asked, and I have seen it on the highway now, so it's something that's going around, and it's nice to see.
It's a big risk for a business to do that, because they don't know where that truck is going. They don't know who's going to react to it. I get it. I think it's amazing. When I first saw it, I approached the COVID Care Alliance and said, this is easy. We've already got a dozen of them that I interviewed that are up on their website who have agreed to go public. We could put all of their, all that we need is the money to put it on there, and find, somebody who is in the trucking industry, I wasn't pointing in Chris's direction, I was swatting a fly, to supply the trucks. We could possibly put that together. That's not a bad take home, a bad thing to activate here tonight. We need to find them. The cost of doing that is a couple $100 with a promise for another $200 in the bank to remove it if it's necessary. That's it. The Canadian COVID Care Alliance already has a dozen people who have been interviewed with their faces and their names and their towns. Max Dagg of the Canadian Adverse Event Reporting System has hundreds of people who would volunteer to get their picture taken and put up there. That's doable. That could be on many, many trucks. So there, if anybody thinks they can put those two things together, that's doable. We just need the trucks to do it, a little bit of money, and the contact CARES, the Canadian Adverse Event Reporting System. Max is the guy's name, and tell him we've got money, you bring us the people, we'll do the trucks. That's doable. That's an active thing that we could activate here today. Does anybody on our panel want to say anything that I haven't asked tonight? Yes.
So just on that, you mentioned, Preston Manning said we need a salt tax. Something that really disturbs me is that we already have a salt tax and Canadians didn't take it to the streets.
Yes.
It's called the carbon tax. The carbon tax is our salt tax. The government is literally charging us tax on the very thing that supports our plant life on this planet. It makes our food, whether it's an animal or a vegetable. And it also, in some form or another, provides the energy that we need to sustain life, to manage our climate, to do all these things. So we already have a salt tax per se. It's something that we need to survive. And why I bring this up is that I think everybody needs to come to terms with the fact that things may not change. We may go through some really horrible things going forward. I mean, Vlad pointed out that being free is not normal in the grand scheme of humanity. Tyranny is the norm, and we might go through that. But, be that as it may, if we continue to do things like this and build these communities within our communities of people who we know we can count on, people who we know are on board with our idea that, no matter what's going on around us, no matter whether there's a chain on our restaurant door, we are free to make some friggin' hamburgers in the park and serve them to our friends, right? Because even a salt tax or a tax on our life might not be enough to turn the tide and change things. Might have to go through some terrible things. So don't stop gathering, don't stop talking to people, and build these communities so that we can go through it not alone.
Thank you. Vlad, did you have something?
Okay. Talking about the salt tax, you have to also watch these politicians and how, sneaky they are. Like Jason Kenney, he's there, he's talking, and they like to talk and just bring it down to the lowest common thing. And it's not fair that Albertans will be paying a carbon tax, right? And everyone's cheering and high-fiving, and then he says, but we're going to go ahead, we're going to go after the heavy emitters. Okay, so what are they going to do? They're going to go ahead and create a new eco-Stasi force that's going to go and monitor Syncrude and all these heavy emitters, right? That's going to come out of our tax money. And then they're going to go ahead and charge them, and then they're going to just backdoor this carbon tax. You know what I'm saying? So you got to watch these politicians and watch, what they're saying, and not be duped by, like, Pierre Poilievre's the same thing. He says no carbon tax, but he's going to go after the heavy emitters. It's the same play that Jason Kenney made. But one thing is that, I'll end with this, is that when I went and contacted the different councillors in the different counties and talked to them, it gives them encouragement too, because I thought, what's the point of even contacting them? They're all sold out, and right? Don't think like that, because they're in there fighting the trenches, and they're really facing it more than we are, right? Because they're dealing with the top-down bureaucracy of it all. By contacting them and talking with them, you give them encouragement, you give them more fire, you know, to run on, and yeah, so it's important to encourage and inform our politicians, because they're the ones who are going to be bringing the tyranny down on us.
Vlad?
The other point I wanted to mention, to build on the conversation of being independent in terms of your health and being independent in terms of your wealth, the trend and the shift that happened in the society, in the Western world especially, is that, and Canada for example, obviously, is that look at the decline in terms of being producing to consumer society. And people don't understand how significant is that, to the point of Chris earlier, how many truckers retired because of the measures by the government. And if it didn't shift to another industry, whatever it might be, and continue producing into Canadian economy, and as a result elevating Canada as a whole, unfortunately we are going along with the agenda. Because they don't want to have productions, they want to have just consumers, obedient, slaves. That's what they're trying to create. So we have to be proactive to change that dynamic and make sure that we can turn the train, and now we can go back to becoming more producing society rather than consumer society, because when you're producing, you have financial independence and the government has less control over you. So whatever you can personally do, as well as support people around you, because it's not a coincidence, obviously, that they went after the independent businesses first. Because as a business owner, you are independent. You don't like to be told what to do. You don't ask a question to use a washroom or go on vacation. You are independent, right? That's why they went after the business owners, and that's why they're making it so difficult to start a new business in Canada. Think about all the hoops that you have to jump through to start your own business. It's ridiculous. So we have to create solutions, and we have to create strategies and systems where we can bring new businesses into your community, and as a result, the whole community will elevate. Because the taxes from the businesses, that's what supports your community. The Home Depot, the Walmart, their tax is not supporting your community. It's the small businesses that's supporting your community. So when the small businesses go, as Ron was talking about the meals, right? The community goes. And that's how they're able to shift people into the big cities. So we have to be extremely proactive in terms of economic prosperity of every single free Canadian.
Leighton.
Since we're in a Bible chapel, I'm going to leave you with a couple of quotations from the Bible that can guide your activism. The first one is, our Lord and Savior says, we must be salt and light. Salt and light, right? So salt is something that gives life, but it has substance. It can be coarse. It's useful. And of course, that light speaks for itself. He also said we must be wise as serpents, but gentle as doves. Wise as serpents, gentle as doves. So all your activism, I hope, is guided by those thoughts from our Lord and Savior. Thank you.
Amen. Woo! I think that's a good note to end on.